take home the Golden Gloves, you've got to put in the work, and you've got to be tough as nails. Ashley Kalis was driven to achieve. Today, Kalis is still fueled by that same hope, grit, and determination. A mother of 3 school-aged boys and successful business owner who ran testing and vaccination sites across the state. Kalis is the fighter Rhode Island needs right now because it's time for a change. Ashley Kalis for governor.
Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Our program aims to bring in-depth and diverse perspectives from around the world on global issues and discussions of interest. Tonight with us, we have Ambassador Yves Marek from France. He is a diplomat. He's a former chief of staff and political advisor to 6 ministers in France. He currently heads the National Committee on Anti-Personnel Landmines, and he is also an author of a book focused on governance. Roughly, I'm going to attempt a rough translation of the title. Governing is Loving, a moral anthology of the sublime art of human governance, which is based on his insights from his years in politics and diplomacy. He's also an avid chess player and a cultural connoisseur and a very interesting person. Welcome, Ambassador Marek, to the Washington Outsider Report.
Thank you.
Before we delve into your book, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your own background for the sake of our audiences, both here in the United States and elsewhere in the world. If you don't mind telling us what drew you into the political sphere and how did your career start out and what brought you to where you are today?
Thank you very much for your invitation. I am very honored because I follow regularly what you published on political matters and geopolitics, and it's for me always interesting to read your very sharp and accurate analysis on some region, especially on the Middle East and the political situation there. It's very important there is this debate. As for me, I am, in fact, it's probably linked to the book. I will say it after. I'm born in Tunisia, where I live during 18 years. And after that, I went to France, and I made the Institute of Political Studies, National School of Administration. And I am now for some years, a lot of years, I am a civil servant. And in fact, despite the fact I enter in the diplomacy very early, most of my career was made rather in high administration, politics, and in cabinets. I was very close from President Chirac and President Sarkozy, and I was in the cabinet of culture. I had head of staff of the the minister spokesman of the government. I dealt also with tourism, a lot with culture, and I have a lot of other activities since I am the president of the National Center of Heritage of French Songs, something very popular in France and I think even abroad. I have also am the chair of an association of the greatest French dancer, Mrs. Pietra Gala. And I have involved also in chess politics since I was vice champion in Tunisia at my age when I was young, and I still play chess at a decent level. And I was even, I'm president of a chess club with who just won the Cup of France. And I was sometimes president of the French Chess Federation. There's a lot of different activities. But this has probably, especially in my origin in Tunisia, a link with my book, because if I wrote this book about the art of the wisdom of governing, it's probably first because in all my political career, I had occasion to observe and to see the eternal rules of politics. But it's perhaps also because since probably I am from the Mediterranean world, in Tunisia, like in all cities of Italy, there is, and I think in the bazaar of Tehran, probably in the old city of Baghdad and others, there is probably a sort of special urbanity, a respect for all values, special relation between neighborhood without so much distinction between rich and poor, relations very fluid between nobles and the craftsman, and a sort of common sense about or reasonable politics. When the politics I saw in Tunisia during the presidency of Bourguiba, with a part of enlightenment about of measures, of good measure, of moderate discussions, a climate which is, I think, something very particular to the old world and old cities. And probably in this book there is a sort of nostalgia of an old art, old wisdom of politics. Not really a nostalgia, because my assessment, and it's probably the thing I want to prove in my book, it's that this is an everlasting data. It never changed, and from the Chinese of the Greeks till today, the human nature is still the same, and we have it's a wrong thing to forget that.
You mentioned the old values of cities and the political rules. Over time, we have seen waves of populism shake those foundations, both in the Middle East and North Africa, but also in Europe and as well as in the United States. How do you think these waves of populist politics measure against the foundations that you mentioned? And can you elaborate on what they are and whether they're a guard against these populist sentiments, or is it a natural cycle and just something that eventually returns?
I think we are exactly in the heart of the problem. To say the truth, I have some difficulties about the criticism of populism. Mm-hmm. Because precisely my book is a bit a book against this idea that there is reasonable politics made by the elites, and populism were a threat. And if you see all the story of mankind, of politics, normally I think it's an illness, sort of illness, to think that good politics are necessary unpopular politics. And I think that populism is a normal thing. I have worked with a great French statesman, very clever, very reasonable, very intelligent. And he often said that the populism we never do, we have to do at the maximum. Because it's not forbidden for government to take popular measures. The idea that good measures are unpopular measures are measures who can cause prejudice to people, I think it's a new idea of the power of technocracy, of people who don't really understand politics because they don't love people and don't love mankind. All the reflection I gathered prove that, in fact, a good politician is really someone who is very linked intuitively with his people. And normally, the good measures go in accordance with common sense. And when we can see this also in firms, in business, I think when you imagine a measure and when you imagine that there will be opposition and you try to lie, for example, or to buy a lot of service of communications to sell the measures, probably in most of cases, it's because the measure is not so good. All the speech about the threat of populism, I think it's something which indicates that probably we have not the good vision of politics and the good idea of the good policies. That's why I think that it's necessary to give more dignity to the art of governing, because if it was one of my ideas of the book, before the democratic era, we have emperors, kings, and they have counselors, Machiavelli and others, and there are all great literature about the art of governing. This literature has almost disappeared because probably in our democratic era, there's a fiction that the people is perfect, that all persons are rational, person with a great virtue and good calculation, and the policies are only equations, problems and solutions. And then we ask only to the politicians to be honest and to do a good job without lying. It's totally wrong, in fact, because there is not the rationale from one side and the general politics, the fact to inspire trust, to give to people the envy to follow you, the fact to understand what you are doing, to give them good measures, to take good policies. There are, even in economy, we know that economy is half psychology. We have to have psychology in the market to give trust. There is not from one side something totally rational and mechanic. and other side, bad people want to lie to. Then I think that we have to be very cautious about this speech about populism, because the mere fact that we speak of populism can indicate that in fact we are afraid of the people himself.
Mhm. I think there is a significant deal of confusion between in terms that are being used to describe certain political trends. There is a confusion between mass movements, which can have positive or ill effects depending on what turn they took. The culture that informs them, as they say that politics is downstream from culture, and the measure of response by government officials to these movements and to demands. And sometimes it's hard to separate a movement, a particular political, social, cultural trend from the response and from the style of response. We are seeing the discussion of populism in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere as if it's something distinct from the demands, the needs, and movements that have created a particular response tendency to those styles. Can you comment on what lens do you think would be better to use to separate these issues and to address the fact that there are some demands created by time, created by circumstances, created by political realities, but the response to them is what creates the perception of populism or the opposite of it.
Yes, even Machiavelli, who has a bad reputation, said that it's very rare that the desire of the people are bad. And the problem is, of course, there are populism who are very brutal and with very stupid ideas and very sort of caricature. But on the other hand, the reasonable people generally are not able to conquer the heart of the people for question of languages, for lack of empathy, and perhaps they are afraid of the eruption of something more instinctive, more animal, and because in their current lives, and I see it every day in the world of high civil servants. A lot of people has lost contact with ordinary people, and they cannot feel precisely what are the demands of the people, and it's a vicious circle, because in fact the more you are far from the ideas and the feelings of the people, the more you felt insecure when the people criticize the policy you are doing.
In all the years that you've spent observing different political trends, what lessons have you drawn about what works and what doesn't, and what makes somebody an effective, good statesman versus somebody who is merely opportunistic and catering to current trends? What exactly, where does that distinction lie?
It's both all the things I observed during my career, and all the general consensus of philosophers, statesmen, writers during centuries and centuries. Probably, if I have to say some of characteristic of good government, First, at some extent, even at the for the statesman, there is probably a sort of mystic way, because the more you have to take very hard and difficult decision for the future of all the people of the nations, we have, like General de Gaulle of others, to have a special link, even a sort of special mystic link, because you are like, I think, probably someone who ride horse, a special communion between the horseman and the horse. It's not something rational, it's something, and even great orators, when they are in front of a crowd, there's something special of communion. And I think that probably all politicians who see politics as files and problems with solution, they can obviously take good decision by hazard, but they can not do great statesmen, and they cannot really do something good for the people. There are also characteristics, for example, of behavior. It's necessary to have a sort of majesty. We saw that. I think it's not unfair to say that, but our former president, President Hollande, has said that he wanted to be a président normal president, and he was mocked a lot, even by people who said that before, that politics has to be close from people. In fact, they don't want that. And I think it's when you represent, you belong to another order, and you enter in history. And even people who officially say that they want governments who are simple, they are not very happy if there's not something which is in relation with history, fate, destiny, and something more impressive, magical in the power. Another thing, I think, to go against the ideas who are now in the modern world on the table, I think that great statesmen, great politicians, and even politics in itself is very far from the world of ideas. And the politician who say, or civil servant who say that the politics has to deal with the future, or to imagine ideas, concepts for the future world, are generally wrong. Greatest politicians and greatest philosophers of the political facts generally say that we have first to continue what was before, and not to make tabula rasa, and after to begin. You have rather, it's better to decide the problem of the day that to take decision now according to ideas you have of the future 20 years after. Probably in some years we will conclude that we made a lot of enormous errors because of climate. Because in fact we are deciding according to mathematic models, and then the decision today are not really accurate. In France, there are a lot of debate about the fact that we have destroyed our industry, but it's largely because during the years 70s or 80s, there are a lot of intellectuals who said now we are in the world of commodities. No need at all of industry is the past. And then we let all the industry go to China, and we will have only the added value of intelligence. And we understand now that it's totally stupid, because if someone has made all the job, at the end he will all have engineer too, and not only workers. And it's a type of decision who are inspired by ideas. And even since it's your specialty, I think in international relations, we see that there are some states who are very efficient, without any judgment about their politics, because they concretely know precisely what they want in their regional environment. I think probably Turkey, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Azerbaijan, Emirates, Israel. They know a bit precisely what are their interests. And there are other countries who have more intellectual aims, abstracts, who can make the great errors, because it's not very linked to something obvious, natural, and probably it's one of the teaching of my book. It's like, if I can joke, that the more human part of man is animal. It's when you pursue your interests, when you are very basic, first the people understand more clearly, because has very clear aims of food, of commodities, and even you made less errors, because if you have to provide services, good policies, it's more easy to understand and to implement. When, like it's the case now in our world of communication, when you have a lot of objectives, aims of communication about general ideas, gender, climate, or more for the communication and for intellectuals, you have a greater risk to make decisions who are not very sound rationally.
How does it come to be that some of the countries that have clear election cycles, and where you would think that the decision-making process, that the policy and governments would be driven by immediate and clear needs, actually end up being less efficient about the decision-making process and more driven by ideas than states that may have longer or different election cycles, or no election cycles at all, or some level of a longer-term continuity. You would think that in a very vibrant democratic setting, this concept of abstract ideas would be less potent because of the practical needs to get elected, and the fact that there are needs that drive those cycles. But yet we are seeing that confusion to which you pointed in a lot of these liberal democratic states. How is it that so many societies have lost the plot on these basics?
Obviously, in some cases, the less democratic system can have more speed in decision, and can have a smaller advantage. On the other hand, there are countries, even in France, before the arrival of General de Gaulle, we had, I think, 22 governments in 12 years. Nevertheless, the government made a great job, because there was a sort of common spirit perhaps a sort of deep state of good policies, a high quality of person who are in charge of different parties, and with some difficulties, of course, with 22 governments, they succeed in doing a good job during this years. I think that the main danger is less the democracy, that the risk of loss of the ID the mere ID of what is the common sense, and because the lack of political culture in some generation, in some media, the fact that there are, I think we saw even in France, the movement coming from United States, the cancel culture, some excess of gender and some absurd consequences of that, the woke system, when in fact the world of politics is not ruled by the public interests of population, but by the demands of some groups, the demands of identity, all demands maybe is very selfish and not linked with the eternal, the everlasting idea of politics as the way to reach the good and for all. In fact, we are not speaking of the same thing, and that there are a lot of persons who are not at all in the same idea that us of what politics is.
How do we find the balance between national or state or internal interests and assorted factions, lobby groups, identity-driven or class-driven movements and social trends? And how do we create a situation where issues such as gender equality, climate, they do not become an end unto itself, but rather considerations that are just part of the working of the society to improve its own effectiveness? And
I think it's partly a fashion. For example, about climate, the environmental movement was mainly a revolutionary left-wing movement, and they all are against capitalism, industry, and especially against the symbol of the state of industry was a nuclear industry. And now in Europe, especially with the question of Russian gas, even some environmentalists understand that nuclear power electricity is the best for environment. They have difficulties in their parties to admit that, but some of them now, after 10 or 20 years of fight against nuclear industry, understand that the nuclear power is a good thing for the climate of and the emissions. Then I think perhaps this period can stop. I think even though some excess of identity, gender will go to absurd. I saw the debates in the United States about the competition of women with transgender, all the debates. I think that probably at some point the movement will go in the other way. But I think in this manner, I'm very French, because you know the political culture in France is a very, I can say, even a bit totalitarian culture of unity of states. In when I was in the Ministry of Culture, I made the law about the French language in France, because in fact it's very rooted in the French culture that there is only one language. We have absolutely no minority language, or very small, because in fact the French Revolution has destroyed, in the name of unity of republic, all the small languages. And in fact, France is built as a cultural, political culture on the idea of total unity, it's impossible in France to have ethnic statistics, even to say an African American. The only fact to name a difference is a bit racism, because there are only equal persons without any characteristics as to be citizen only, point. Citizen and only citizen, and they have no origin, no language. And I think that this conception, a bit abstract, I admit, because of course persons have their origin, is the best to build a nation, and to prevent for communitarism, and for fight of groups against groups. It works in France. Now there are some debates, because there are some politicians who say that some with Muslim immigration, there are some problems, they cannot integrate. Personally, I think they exaggerate. There are a lot of debate of identity. But precisely, I think these debates are not only in France, but in all the Western world, because with some conception of human rights, or personal human rights, with the idea of groups to have their pride, the gay pride and other one, as groups and not as members of the national entity, there are a lot of pressures of these ideas against the model of unity we have. But I think in France it worked very well. Myself, I am from Tunisia. I'm Jewish, but I forget this. It's not of any importance in my whole life.
It's funny that you mentioned this tension between integration and national identity, because precisely, the United States has always had a very different approach to this than France, but we are seeing it experiencing the same problems, albeit for kind of reverse reasons, where in the US these dual identities were part of the norm, but still they were a norm precisely because you could identify as whatever you were, but also maintain this larger sense of national identity. Now, the attack is not that is on the very concept of having a national identity at all, that the national identity is so deeply flawed that it should not even exist, and that at the end of the day, there seems to be an underlying implication in all these identity movements that it's not possible to have a cohesive national identity without someone being discriminated, subverted by some majoritarian culture, or otherwise seeing injustice. But the result of this disintegration of national identity can be exactly the opposite of what is supposedly intended. National identity gives some level of protection to cultures, whichever approach you choose, whether American or French. And now we're seeing that there is an effort to undermine not just any specific cultural or political attitude towards that, but the very concept of nationalism.
I think there is not a model who is better than another one, because each one is linked with the deep culture of each country. I think that in France, the British of the American model create really problems. Because the only fact to say there is a Latino, is African American, is something in France who is not seen very good. Why is does he remark the color of my skin? It's not. The perception is different, and I can perfectly admit that you can be a Paki in London and to be totally British and to have different cultures and to live in your groups, and even in our unitarian model, in fact, it's not public. But people have their own attachments. They live in their family. They made their religious feast. They have some discrete links into groups. That it's a bit of fiction, but it's a fiction who can protect people to be labeled from belonging to a group. It's a protection to be only a citizen and without an hyphenated citizen with something else. I think it's comfortable.
There are a couple of social phenomena that are not just commented upon, but are not really explored in great depth. First, many of the people who are pursuing identity politics are not immigrants. They're people who are second, third generation, who were born and raised in the country and presumably actually have more opportunities than their parents who came in looking for a better life. This is noted a lot of the time, but it's not explained why that is, why people who are born and raised in the country are more susceptible to identity influence than immigrants, and what can be, how can this distinction be addressed? The second is the type of immigrants, the type of immigration that is being allotted. For instance, a lot of the times, the 19th century waves of economic immigration into the United States led to a great success in integration of people who wanted to be Americans, who were willing to leave their past behind, who were perhaps willing to celebrate cultural elements of their heritage, but ultimately had a particular goal that they were working towards. Versus we are talking about refugees, human rights dissidents, and other people who are being granted the right to stay in the country due to their targeting persecution in other countries, but who may not have otherwise chosen to be in the country to begin with, or who carry particular cultural or political views that influence the direction of their activity, as opposed to merely seeking to find a better life. Those two issues are not really being addressed for various reasons, but I do think it's worth considering whether or not, to what extent that these considerations have an impact or should have an impact on policies and on governance, and on considering why these issues are coming up and whether they can be dealt with more effectively given these realities.
I think it's one of the ideas of the book that if the king of the government has a special link of love, perhaps, with the people, he has to be part of a sort of fairy tale of the nation. Mm-hmm. And it's very linked, because when you rule a country as a good father of family, for example, or like someone who tell a fairy tale to the country, to have an identity. You are writing the next stage of history of a nation who have this history. It's probably more easy to integrate immigrants because you have a story to tell to them, and you have a hope to give to them, because they know what is the new imagination that they can have, because people have dreams. They need to have dreams, and they have good reason to be proud of their cultures. They came from great civilizations. They can prefer the food of their origin country. It's normal. But if you, especially when there are strong cultures, they can be proud of them. It's difficult to integrate them if the nation who welcome them is not proud of him of herself. And we have, in fact, probably this type, all question of immigration, of identities, are obviously personal, even psychoanalytic reasons. For example, I read studies in France about the difficulty of the second generation. The first one had relatively no difficulties. They wanted to be in groceries, in industry, and to make works, and to have to build a future for the child. But I read study that about the fact only that when the child go to school, it begin to be skillful in French, and that at some point he can be ashamed of his parents, because his parents cannot speak French or even Arabic in his country. He cannot write it. And it's difficulty of integration due to a personal problem. And there is only special situation how to mix the pride of the origin and the pride of the new country, and it's a very complicated, and minorities know that very well. Jewish, Armenians, or they know how to deal of that. But of course, it's only personal, even psychoanalytic question for each of them to define themselves. I think on a more general point of view, that there is a challenge probably in France and in all other countries of European Union. Probably the European project is something who disturb the fact to be a part of the nation, because if a lot of people are convinced that the nation and the country is finished, and now the next step is to be part of a new dream of Europe, perhaps one day there will be European citizens and live perfectly with that. But in the meantime, they have no clear identity if, because of Europe, they have rejected the French one. And there is not only the problem of integration of immigrants for other countries of the South, there are probably problems of identification of the elites with the nation, another secession, because they are uneasy with even the idea of France or Germany, probably for Italy. We often, it's in small classes, reach this speech.
You mentioned the important concept of this national narrative or fairy tale, or a story that successfully draws in new migrants who are entering the country. And now, I mentioned this assault on nationalism, and I mentioned these attacks on national identities, which include not just political concepts, but these efforts to erase the kind of a glorious element of the national story, the cultural elements that create this common ground, create a sense of bonding and a common history, and more importantly, a common destiny. And they attempt to undermine that by focusing excessively on the differences, on past grievances, and creating a culture of grievance and self-criticism that is not constructive in moving forward, but rather destructive of this national narrative. As someone with a great love for French culture, you earlier mentioned your involvement with the French Song Institute and your past cultural involvements. How do you think statesmen, governments can facilitate this cultural response to these efforts to undermine this common narrative? How can culture play a role in preventing this destruction of this common ground?
Personally, I think that we need a strong cultural policy. I wrote a book about the cultural policy. In France, we have a tradition from the king to have great state sponsorship. We have not private sponsorship like United States. It's not in the mentality. We made some laws about that, but without great success. And even I think that the law were not well written. Because it's very special to the French administration. If you really read the law about sponsorship, you can see that they are not made like in the United States, that for all citizens who want to give money to culture. They are made mainly for great companies to give money to the state. The idea for the person who wrote these laws is that the head of staff of the Minister of Culture can call the great French company to give money to the Louvre. It was not a general democratic movement of sponsorship if you see precisely the tax law in France. Then we have great, with a lot of subsidies, political cultural policies. Nevertheless, probably during the last 20 years, we lost something was present during the presidency of Charles de Gaulle with the minister André Malraux. Is the idea to make available all the work of the spirits of all times to people. And we have a lot of great subsidies, but perhaps less on common culture, and probably less popular. Because if you see in detail, I wrote a book about that. In fact, great part of the new money given to culture either go to public institutions with heavy costs, trade unions, a lot of bad use of, not for culture, but for prestigious building, great architects, a lot of structures, even great buildings, we cost a lot to heat. Then the first misuse of the money. The second one is lot of political spendings, cultural spendings, went not to give culture to the people, but to give money to the artists who can give appreciation to the power. And you can see this in a lot of details if you enter in the details of political, of cultural policies. For example, we made exhibition in the galleries or museum during 1 month, 2 months. Then it costs a lot. If the exhibition is good, you have, like in the trade, you have to let 4 months or 3 months, 4 months. You don't know that. Why? Because you have to make to give a gift to the artist. The more the exhibition, the more inauguration, the more artists, not the public. For the public it's less, because in 1 month you have not the public, you have in 3 months and less communication. There are a lot of details, even in theater. It's the same. There are a lot of creations, and artists like to say that I create the spectacle, but in fact the spectacle is only for 3 days, and after there's nobody. But you have created it, and it was not the case before. If you see the cultural policies in France, it's something very funny. Then all the socialists who have increased a lot the budget of cultures from 1980, always to defend culture, quote Jean Villard and other personality of the theater as great example. And at each time we want to reduce the credits, they say that we are killing Jean Villard and others. But what they forget generally, that Jean Villard was before the increase of credits. Jean Villard did not need this credit, and he made culture anyway. That's why there is probably a bit of misuse. And for the same reason, I think I go back to the wisdom of art of governing. It's, I think, exactly the same phenomenon like in politics, when you have technocrats who lose linked with the people and made policies who are not accurate. It's the same idea, that sort of elite who forgets that they are working to share. And a spectacle, a work of art, and who is not shared, it's a pity. And even it's a negation of the work of art, because you have to share, to create emotion with a novel, with a film. When artists, it's more and more the case, contemporary art, have not the patience to share, and when all the public institutions are not obsessed by the sharing, we lose something, even in the matter of art. And in politics, it's the same. When a politician is convinced that it's not necessary to be popular, that he wants to do the wellness of the people against him, because he has in the mind deeply rooted the idea that the good is the people will suffer, probably he is wrong.
What then can be done to kind of bring the culture back to the people and kind of avoid this conundrum that these niche groups or individuals are getting the support, but they end up having no social impact and no appreciation from the public?
Probably, I think there is a work about the language. Because I think it's that's why I made the law about the French language. It's the most shared heritage of the population, and generally a part of identity of a nation, even misused when you see with Ukrainian and Russian, the Russian part of Ukraine, something like that. It's a lot of conflict about that, of course. But clearly, the language, the second nation, and for a lot of persons, and sort of mark of identity. And when the politicians are not able to speak to all. And even we thought that when they use technical words, it's stupid, because I cannot, in English, I have a lot of example in French, but often the politician use the language of the technician inside, who had, for example, I try to translate an example. In France, when you give the weather, when there is a tempest, there is a word is classification red. Why the journalist says that we are in a red situation? No, there is a tempest. Why to make the reality defined by the words of a cast? And it's very often the case. And I think that I am sure that the people is incredibly clever. Individually often, and collectively certainly, and the common sense is really common, and people understand perfectly and very cleverly all the questions. Then it's very perfectly possible to explain and to speak in a way that is understandable by all.
Now we are seeing this situation, this disconnect is being exploited. We're seeing that in the US, for instance, the evolution of language is driven not by the government, but by completely unelected institutions. Just to give you an example, the Washington Post, a very renowned newspaper, decided that it would capitalize racial names for no reason. Until now, the words black, white, and so forth were not capitalized. They were just colors. Now they were capitalized to indicate racial context. And all of a sudden, we're seeing that not only Washington Post started doing it, but other media started doing it, and regular people who were never taught to do that in school started doing it just because the Washington Post did. And somehow, something that one specific publication decided to do for their own editorial policy reasons is being picked up not only as a trend, but as the only right and trendy thing to do for reasons that no one can explain. But the US cannot control the media to that extent. They cannot dictate editorial policies to these institutions. If they decide to start spelling something that is not technically linguistically correct, I mean, normal people would just laugh and ignore that, but somehow the society has become a lot more open to taking cues from institutional influencers. How do you see this balance between institutions driving policies and social changes versus the government?
Yes, in fact, there is a risk of the terrorism of minorities. In France, there are some groups who try now to impose a change of spelling of words with what they call inclusive writing with .coms and something totally absurd that normal people don't understand. And I saw all the debate in the United States. I remember that journalist of New York Times, I think probably Barry Weiss, dismissed for some sort of persecution inside the newspaper. And in fact, there is a risk of some terrorism, because in some cases, these groups who can impose their views by means who are not totally fair, sort of intimidation, accusation of being reactionary if you don't go in this matter. And I think it's why it's important to have leaders who are in accordance with the majority and not only the majority but the general story of the country and of his history, to prevent sort of taking an hostage a country by groups. I remember the last time I spoke in a radio in the United States, when I made the law about the French language. I was invited by Pat Buchanan on his channel. He was very aggressive because I was a French against English. But my surprise was that after 20 minutes of discussion, very harsh between us, there was 40 minutes of calls from listeners for all America. And my surprise, and his surprise more, was all people at the phone told that France was right, that the United States need an English language law, that in some cases that they have not the right to have some products because they have only documents in Spanish, they have not consumer information in English, and there was a lot of debate. It was the same thematic about the fact that the rule of minority can be a difficult problem for the majority.
The latest example of what you're saying that was the new production of the West Side Story, where part of the dialogue was entirely in Spanish with no subtitles. And the reason for that, according to Steven Spielberg, was out of respect for that group. But I don't really see how making most people not understand what you're saying is respectful. You know, if people don't understand you, they don't understand you.
And it's probably a violation of the rights of author, because I saw what happened to Harry Potter also, but I think that we cannot change a work of art with political views.
That's also a good point. Now, I wanted to kind of go into a slightly different direction. We've been discussing these specific issues, but I wanted to ask you about something a little bit more general. There's frequently a very common comparison between chess and geopolitics or politics in general, and there's this underlying assumption that being a proficient chess player makes someone a more effective politician because you think ahead. Is that actually accurate? Do you think that chess gives statesmen an advantage in politics, makes them more calculating, more efficient in understanding the moves of the other parties, or is that not? Or is this concept not really translatable to human nature?
No, there's an interesting point. In fact, chess is not totally related to, as we can imagine, because there are king and it's a game of two armies. In fact, it seems to be a political game. In fact, concretely, I thought that most of chess players are we find them between spirits who are more linked with mathematics, with engineers, informatics, numeric, digital industries, and music. In the political world, I remember myself with the National School of Administration of Institute of Political Studies, there was very few chess players. And even I know that the former president of Armenia was a chess player. There are a lot, but I think that Putin is a poor chess player. It's more judo than chess. It's not really, despite Russia has a great reputation in this field. I think of course, he defends the national sport, but I think he's not very skillful in this matter. Because in fact, there is probably a misunderstanding about chess. When someone who cannot play chess meet another person who plays chess, the more frequent question is, you calculate how many moves before. And in fact, when you speak with real chess players, especially with very good chess players, they don't calculate so much. Of course, you have to, if I put my queen head, he will take it. But in fact, at a high level, you are comparing schemes, patterns. Like in music, you hear some music and you say it's a fugue, it's a sarabande, it's allegro, because you see the beauty, the aesthetic, formal beauty of a concept, an abstraction. You can imagine the beauty, like great mathematicians who often are poets, because they can give poetic names, patterns to something which is abstract. And I can link that with politics at this point, and with my book, that we have a great depth with Orient. I think that we now, especially with the industrial period and the last wars, with a sort of pretension of rationality, we tend to imagine that there is a Western rationality, very deductive, rational, mechanical, like the chess player who calculate four moves before. And when we study the thought of great thinkers from Epictet, Marc Aurèle, and we compare to Lao Tzu, Confucius, Sun Tzu, we discover that between the Stoicians, the Greeks, and even in Italian Renaissance, and the Chinese and the Indians, it was very close. And the Arabs, I quote a lot of Arabs too in my book, because in the past, during the Middle Age, in the Italian Renaissance, even with the Byzantines, the Greeks, and the Orthodox, and the link between the Orthodox and the Catholics, the influence of even in the Greek civilization, we have in Rome too, you have the cult of Mithra, the Egyptian, the link with this old thinking of Orient was very strong. And probably if we want to build a sort of thinking of humanity and to go back to an idea of politics who is more human, we probably have to rediscover this part of not mechanical thinking or coming from Orient, because there is a sort of wisdom which is present. And I go back to chess. The difference between the game of Go, who seems to be more Asiatic, positional, more the recognition of patterns, when you speak with very great chess players like Vladimir Kramnik, who is very, very intelligent, who work with artificial intelligence, he can explain that when his brain is working, is more and less in calculation and more like the player of Go in the positional play, giving force, equilibrium, and more in the unidirectional and more in the fluidity. Because in fact, you know, the traditional difference in Greek philosophy between Parmenid, who is a man of the fixity, and Heraclitus, who is a man of the river and the flow, who change, and the life is rather in the second part. And politics, the good politics, the bad politics, and dictators and totalitarians always wanted utopia lasting 1,000 years. They want, even the communists and all the others, they have a model with, when it defined perfectly, even the utopist socialist French, like Proudhon or Fourier, they imagine an ideal city, but it's not, but there is no change in it. And the real humanity is change. It's fluidity. It's to allow the movement of life. And I think if we want people to be more close from politics, we have to give of the politics another idea, more linked with human character, with the time, with the effect of time, because it's a real life. I remember there is a famous American economist who make a very funny book about the bad effects of economics and the links with social. He explained, for example, that if the criminality is lower in parts, it's only because the criminals have age, has married, have children, that they cannot do robbery, and the new women who can have criminal have aborted because the law of abortion changed, and then a lot of things we often that politics cannot imagine in a very defined circle of time. In fact, the life solves problems more easily than rational, who is very weak in some cases, because they ignore the movement of life.
Speaking of the movement of life, there is much criticism of contemporary government officials and statesmen, claiming not only that they're far away from their roots and so forth, but they're simply not sufficiently prepared to deal with the challenges of governance. That they're prepared for campaigns, for promises, for the taking advantage of the power, but not for the actual practical reality of governance. Do you think returning to classical education in schools, do you think creating higher standards of education and greater expectations from average citizens would create a better class of statesmen?
I was always very reluctant about the idea of education. The debate was the same in France, because in fact, most of people who wanted to have an education to citizenship in schools, they probably, most of them, and the people who will vote for this, for example, they want to, that they imagine that the teacher will teach respect, rules, the respect of authority. But in reality, when you have the sociology of teachers, the demands of the media, you have a great risk that you have speeches about the last idea about the climate, about the rights of something, or the right, but not the duties. And I imagine that in most of cases, the teacher, the school, the person in charge of education to citizenship will not deliver the message the person that wanted them to teach that will teach. Really, they will teach something else. I think that the solution is better, because we are in democracy, and I think that people are very clever, is to have more debates. Probably in the United States you have more debates than in France, because in France, for example, it's very known that when a politician says something wrong to a journalist, the journalist doesn't ask a second question to say, but it's wrong. Well, they stop and they go to the second question. And in fact, we have a tradition of authority and not of check and balance. But the more there is debate, the more, because at the end, it's a sentence in my book, there is only things, all the strengths of the logic. The more you give room to logic, the more there is, and the way to prove, to discuss, to prove that something is wrong, the more you have a debate of good quality. And I am sure that all the people can understand good arguments, bad arguments, and the result of debate. Generally, each time that there is something wrong in democracy is because there was no debate. Because I think even in real estate where there are 20 landowners, or in any village, I think in India or in Africa, about the repartition of grain or something like that, all people around the tree are totally able to have a clear understanding of what is going and what is a good measure. It's only when they cannot, there is only a sort of terrorism of media or terrorism of communication, that there is a problem, because we cannot make the logic prevail to insanity.
Finally, speaking of education and changes and so forth, you've come a long way. You've had a great deal of experience in the cultural sphere, in political sphere. How did you come from all this background, a lot of it cultural, to now working with landmines and issues that are defense oriented completely? It seems quite a leap.
Yes, because I am a civil servant, and we have the special tradition in France that in the staff of ministers, they are not mainly political advisors who are tackling with the constituency and the press, making just politics, but they are civil servants coming from administration who can help them with the relation with the administration. Then you can be in politics and to stay civil servants in France. And even I made more clearly politics during some years, because I rule the party of the friend of Jacques Chirac during some years. It was a party of 70,000 members, and we helped to this second re-election in 2002. And after some years in cabinets, I went back to my administration, or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then I was appointed ambassador in charge of the struggle against landmines and cluster munitions. We had the play. I was in Geneva last week for our last meeting, where we spoke a lot about Ukraine, where cluster munition and anti-personnel mines are used. We had the pleasure to hear from the announcements of the American administration, because as you perhaps know, there was a policy of ban of mines in the United States, except for Korea. And President Trump has imagined to change this policy and to use again mines of special types can destroy. President Biden, I thought, wanted to do the same that President Trump, but he decided a review of his policy. At the end, he decided to come back to the policy before, and that United States, except in Korea, will not use export landmines. That it was a good news for all the community of demining. And we are helping some countries, as France, in demining. Last year and this year, we are helping Azerbaijan for €500,000 for equipment to help for demining, because they in the liberated territories they found a huge amount of mines, and there are a lot of persons who were displaced 30 years ago and who want to go back in this region, who are now sort of desert with a lot of destructions. And France is helping Azerbaijan, but we are helping other countries, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Syria, Mauritania, and a lot of countries in Africa, because there are a lot of improvised landmines put by terrorist groups in the Sahel, in Iraq, by Daesh. And there's a lot of work to do.
Another country that unfortunately will make this list is Yemen, which has a very significant landmine problem. Do you think there's an opportunity for international cooperation in that regard?
Yes, we are helping Yemen. There are some NGO and United Nations agencies, especially the United Nations Program for Development, who is working in Yemen. There are in fact a lot of mine and even cluster munition used by Houthis, and there's a lot of work to do. It's a bit complicated. Of course, we had also proposal to make demining in the port of Hodeida, because there are also submarine demining, and of course, and there are some help, I think, for Saudi Arabia, who give money and is funding some companies to help demining in Yemen. And of course, it's a country who is living drama for years and years. It's a pity, even for the cultural heritage of this incredible country. And we hope, all hope that the peace will come, and all the population can live in peace.
For sure, I think the organization you were referring to, Project Masam, the Saudi demining project, I think they're doing work in demining there. So
yeah, there are some operation in Yemen despite the difficulty.
What do you think can be done to facilitate international coordination on these issues? Because I understand that in many of these countries there are various independent and UN affiliated efforts, but a lot of the times one of the problems is that these efforts are entirely not coordinated with each other, and there is very little joint exchange of expertise in a lot of the instances.
No, I'd rather say that there's rather good communication. Now, for the moment, I am the president of the Mine Action Support Group for this year, and this group gathers all the countries who are donors. The annual amount of the given by the donors is around $500–600 million. About 40% of this amount is given by United States, and other major donors like Japan, Germany, Norway. France is not a great donor. We are only about 12. I increase this each year, but not important amount, but we do some things anyway. And we have good coordination because we have two conventions, the Convention of Ottawa about mines and Convention of Oslo about cluster munition, with special procedure, and we review the work of each country. We give them extension if they cannot finish the job and then there is a very, very precise study of the situation of each country, a study which is made not only by the states, but only by NGOs. And the NGOs are participating to our meetings, and they speak after the states, but they can express strong criticism about countries who are not doing what they have to do to demine, who give data who are not accurate, who have not a very precise plan. And I think that there is rather a good coordination of efforts. Of course, we can do a lot of progress. For example, I emphasize on the fact that it's not normal, and it's a pity that in some cases, donors have obstacle from the beneficiary countries. We find money, we want to give them money to them, but we have problems with the customs to make the things enter the material for demining enter in the country. Problem of visa for the experts, or in some cases 9 months to give accreditation to the NGO to make demining, despite the fact that an NGO operates already in 50 countries in the world, is absolutely well known. And we have, in fact, in some cases, some problems of bureaucracy, and it's a pity because for countries like France, for example, we have an annual budget. If we lose 6 months, perhaps we will not have the money we decided to give the year after. But for intellectually, I will say that there is rather good coordination, and we know rather good the situation of each country.
I think this initiative is wonderful. I hope more NGOs that are involved in this issue will learn about that and can contribute and be of assistance. And I think this has been a very enlightening conversation. I thank you for joining the program. I thank you so much for giving us some insights into your book, and I hope it comes in English soon, because I can think of many people in the US who
Thank you very much.
read it. And I would certainly enjoy reading that as well, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining. For those who've been watching, this was the Washington Outsider report on the Coalition Radio. With us was the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. That's me, Irina Zuckerman, and Ambassador